Hello everyone, I'm KM Chess, and in this video, I'll be playing a 15-10 rapid chess game on chess.com. I'll also be explaining every move as I go, so you can understand why I'm playing them. Alright, I'm going to send out a challenge. Let's see what the rating is of the person I'm playing. Alright, so he is playing white, and he is a 1200. I'm not sure if he's actually active right now. Alright, there we are. Let's see what opening he wants to play. I just started out with e5, nice and simple, and I know it very well. Right here, I'm moving the knight to defend the pawn on e5, but it's just a basic opening, so most people will know what to play in this situation. It's later on where it gets more complicated. Alright, so now I'm going to push this pawn to allow the bishop to come to g4 and pin this knight to the queen. If he allows me to do that, then I'll bring this knight in and double attack the pinned piece. Alright, in this case that's not actually the best move, as it still allows my knight to come to d4. Usually you'll either see h3 played or bishop e2. Both of those moves either threaten the bishop, make it move, or break up the pin. That just seems like it's throwing away a bishop. Yes, I believe it is. Alright, so I'm just going to take. In this case, I actually should have taken the queen, but I missed that on the fly, so that's why you should always take your time when you're making a move. Alright, breaking up the pin. And after he takes back, I'll just bring the bishop back. So right here, I could either play bishop h5, bishop h3, or just bring it back to either e6 or d7. I believe I'm going to play h3 because now my bishop is focused on f1 and my other bishop is focused on c1, and that thus prevents both the king from castling either direction. Alright, he's double attacking, threatening mate on f7 and threatening the b7 pawn. To defend against that, I am going to play I believe I'll play knight h6. That way it defends the f7 pawn and defends against checkmate. And it also leaves my queen on the 8th row so that my rook can come over and oh, he just missed the fork. I guess he was assuming that because of my bishop here, I wouldn't be able to push this pawn. But because I would also be threatening the queen at the same time, if pawn here, it attacks both these pieces. You can't take the bishop because then I take the queen. And he can't. Here, there we are. He can't come here or here with check, because the bishop and the queen defend here, and the queen defends this square of c7. And that was a blunder. He moved the queen right into the path of the e5 pawn. Alright, it looks like my opponent has disconnected. Whether that's on purpose or not is, I don't know. It's not for me to say. But, alright, there we are. I won by abandonment because he left the page. Alright, I'll play another game because looks like the person I had played against had not yet established a set rating. So it wasn't an accurate chess game. Alright, to start with e4, e5, knight f3, alright, pawn d6, and let's see, alright, 1273. Right here, by this move, my opponent is stopping me from ever moving the bishop on c1 to g5. That way it prevents a bunch of threats on the queen and threats of pins with the knight. Right here, I'm just going to develop another piece. Move the knight out to c3. Here, by this pawn move, I'm opening up the bishop to come to e3 sometime in the future, not necessarily on the next move. Here my opponent is pinning my knight to my queen, but I don't really care because I'm most likely going to castle queenside. So I can afford to... Oh, he decided to take instead. Alright. Now I'm going to push the g-pawn, hopefully on the next turn, to g5. And what I'm trying to do here is make this knight on f6 move, because then it would reveal Scholar's Mate on f7. Alright. Seems like he sacrificed a pawn. Now his rook is sunk. His queen can't take because of my queen on f3, and his rook has no way to escape. Alright, threatening the weak c2 pawn, but I don't really mind because I can always just push. pushed to safety. Now it's defended by the b2 pawn. This also prevents any thoughts of check on b4 with the bishop. Now I'm going to pin this knight, because once I'm up pieces, I want to trade off as many of my pieces for his as possible. That way I can get into a winning endgame with an almost certainly winning position. Here I'm preparing to castle. I'm not really too concerned about him taking the pawn. I'm up 7 points, and if he does take the pawn, it allows me to trade the queens off. Allowing me to trade off again. This also opens up the d file for my rook. So now, after I push, I assume his pawn is going to take, or else, no, he can't really defend it, because if he does try to defend it with, let's say, queen e6, something like that, then as soon as takes, the d file is open and I'm attacking his rook. Alright, threatening the weak pawn in a2. Just going to move my king over. Here I'm probably going to lose a pawn, but I don't really care, as I've traded off some major pieces. Now I'm going to play queen e3. This way I attack g5 pawn, and I defend my f2 pawn. At the same time, if he chooses to move his queen anywhere but, oh, my mistake, anywhere but a4 or d7, the a7 pawn would fall. Alright, I'm going to bring my rook onto an open file, where rooks are always most effective. And if he does try to check me with g6, I don't really care, as I can always just move the king. Now I can pin his queen. And he resigned, because he knew that once we traded off queens, he didn't really have much chance with an even amount of pawns, and actually I have one extra pawn and a rook. Alright, I think I'll play one more game. Let's see who my opponent will be this time. I am playing a 1249. Alright. Same king's pawn opening. Alright, 3 knights game. I'm going to bring the bishop out to c5, thus keeping it the 3 knights game instead of bringing the knight out to my other knight out to g6. Alright, threatening the knight. If I did allow him to take after I played a move like knight f6, then after takes and takes, he would have a free pawn on e5. So I can't allow him to do that. So I'll just push this pawn. This way I defend the e5 pawn, although I do pin my knight to my king. Now I'll release the pin by breaking it up with my bishop. I'm guessing on this turn he's going to play d3. That way it opens up his bishop to come to g5 or somewhere around there. Or he'll just push it 2 spaces, and that will actually give away the pawn, because I can take with my knight, since my knight is no longer pinned. Then after takes, I'm up a pawn. Alright, if I go back to the previous position, right here, if I had played, for example, if I took with the e-pawn, then he could play an in-between move of taking my knight with his bishop, and then he wouldn't have lost a pawn. The same thing would have happened if I took with the bishop, because then it also allows him to take the knight as an in-between move. So the only way to actually gain a pawn here was to take with the knight. Here I'm not too worried about that bishop, so I'm just going to bring the knight out, develop another piece. If he does take, it would always just allow me to open the g-file for my rook. So now my rook can come to g8. Alright, here's one threat I do have to watch out for. He's threatening me with knight takes f6, and that way, if he brought his knight here, it would fork my king and my queen. So I believe my best move in this situation is, if I did bring my queen over to e6, then he just take on c7, and again fork my queen. So he has a lot of threats here, but as long as I just move my king, I should be fine. It'll lose a pawn, but nothing more. Here, I only really have one good move, because if I move my bishop here, it's just going to be captured by the pawn. If I move my bishop here, he can just push again, thus forcing my bishop back again. So my only good move in this situation is to bring it back 2 spaces. Alright, he's preparing to threaten my bishop. Alright, so here I would like to play rook to g8, but if I do play that, he can take the pawn on f6 and fork my rook and my queen. So I have to first play pawn here to allow my bishop a space to retreat, if he decides to push the pawn. And then, before I ever play g8, alright, so now I no longer have to play an in-between move of queen e6, because his knight is gone. Now I can just take his knight, and I'm in a much better situation. Alright, since I'm still up a pawn, I'm going to try to force trade. Alright, he accepted. Move one of my rooks to an open file. Right here, I'm going to move my rook up here to protect the f pawn, because if he does choose to take, and after takes, his rook would be lined up right on this pawn. So this position is a very interesting one, because if I do choose to play rook f8, then the pawn on d6 is hanging. But if I choose to play rook g6, the pawn on f7 is hanging. So I have to play d7 so as to defend both pawns and allow my rook to come to g6 on the next turn and try to force a trade. Alright, now he's lined up both of his rooks in this pawn. At the moment it's not going to do him any good, because I have two rooks defending it. But in the future, if I ever want to move one of those rooks, I'm going to have to force one of his to move. Now I'm just going to work these pawns down the A and B files and do my best to create a passed pawn. A passed pawn is a pawn where there are no opposing pawns that are stopping it from promoting. Alright, so he has given me an interesting move here. I now can move one of the rooks away and not lose a pawn. Because after I go here, if he chooses to take, then I can take back, he takes, and then I take one of the two hanging pawns. Alright, now I choose one of these two pawns to take. If I chose to take this one, then he could take my h7 pawn. But if I instead take his h4 pawn, it defends my h7 pawn. Huh, that's interesting. Now, I can actually... Yeah. I can play here and go into a pawn race. Not sure if that's a good idea. I'm gonna try it anyway. This could be a very bad idea. But after takes, and he pushes his king, I assume he'll take. Okay, decide to push. Now, that forces me to waste an extra move, as I have to move my king forward so I can push my b-pawn. Now I push the b-pawn. Takes. This pawn is going places. That's going to force his king to follow. Now, my choice is whether to leave it there or push it again. I believe I'll leave it there. This move is an in-between move, which forces his king back and one square farther away from my pawns. Now I can come over and take. And my pawn is going to be promoted. He has no way to stop it. Alright, so we saw that and resigned. So that was 3 games where I explained all my moves. I hope that helped any of you who are watching. And thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.